Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Q&A for the Zoom Q&A for We Burn Like This. I am going to start with a land acknowledgement and then we will dive right in. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded land of the Spokane people and that these lands were once the major trading center for the Spokanes as they shared this place and welcomed other area tribes through their relations, history, trade, and ceremony. We also want to acknowledge that the land holds the spirit of the place through its knowledge, culture, and all the original peoples since time immemorial. As we take a moment to consider the impacts of colonization, may we also acknowledge the strength and resiliency of the Spokanes and their relatives. As we work together making decisions that benefit all, may we do so as one heart, one mind, and one spirit. We are grateful to be on the shared lands of the Spokane people and ask for the support of their ancestors and all relations. We ask that you recognize these injustices that forever change the lives of the Spokane people and all their relatives. We agree to work together to stop all acts of continued injustices toward Native Americans and all our relatives. It is time for reconciliation. We must act upon the truth and take actions that will create restorative justice for all people. And we would like to thank Professor Margot Hill from Eastern Washington University for writing that for SpIFF. And we'd also like to thank Eastern Washington University and Spokane Teachers Credit Union for being our presenting sponsors this year. And now I would like to introduce our host for this Q&A, Neal Schindler from the Spokane Jewish Cultural Film Festival. Take it away, Neal.
Thank you, Elena. Yes, so I am Neal Schindler. I'm the director of the Spokane Jewish Cultural Film Festival and have been since 2014. And I'm excited to speak with Alana Waxman, the director of We Burn Like This. I will take a moment to say that once you have enjoyed all the films of SpIFF, which I encourage you to do, you should also check out the Jewish Film Festival that we organize starting on the 17th of February. We're having an in-person opening night at the Garland, and then the rest of it is virtual, much like SpIFF, a hybrid festival. So. I will now introduce Alana Waxman. She's a writer, director, producer, and descendant of Holocaust survivors from Poland. She holds an MFA in film and television production from the USC School of Cinematic Arts. And while at USC, she was chosen as one of 10 top directors to co-direct USC's first feature film, Don Quixote, the Ingenious Gentleman of La Mancha, which premiered at the Palm Springs International Film Festival and is now available on Netflix. She has written and directed a number of short films and music videos. We Burn Like This, which she wrote, directed, and produced, is her feature debut. Alana is also in development on her second narrative feature, as well as a personal documentary about her father's relationship to Jewish identity. So welcome, Alana. Wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And I should say that we will certainly want any audience questions and comments a little bit later. I'll start off with a couple questions myself, and then we'll kind of open things up a bit more.
Perfect.
So one of the first things I wanted to ask, the first thing, is what compelled you to choose the Jewish prayer, Hebrew prayer, as kind of a through line or a motif for the film? What were you trying to do as a filmmaker with that or get across?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, to Spokane International Film Festival for hosting our Washington premiere. And it's so great when at a few festivals we've been to, the festival has partnered with a part of the local Jewish community to specifically moderate a Q&A for this film. So I really appreciate being able to talk with you specifically, Neal, and because I think we can kind of get into some different kinds of nuances perhaps than other Q&As I've been a part of.
Yeah.
So yeah, and your first question is for sure a part of that. That prayer, I think, you know, this film is about intergenerational historical trauma, which is not an easy thing to show visually. And so I think that this film has been through many different versions. And the first version actually wasn't about Jewish identity at all. It was actually about Native American identity, and the main character was a Native American young woman.
Mm.
And the prayer actually was always a part of this story. And when it was in the first version, it was a Native American prayer.
Mm.
And then when I eventually kind of adapted it to become more personal, I knew I wanted to have a Jewish prayer that kind of wove in and out. And so I lived in Missoula for most of the time that I was making this film in Montana. And the local rabbi in Missoula is Lori Franklin. And so I went to Lori and described kind of the prayer that I was hoping for, which to me was, the intention behind it was a prayer for healing. And so Lori helped me figure out what might be a good prayer to have, and that for the people who know what that prayer is, that she felt that it would bring a particular kind of I guess interpretation or a meaning for the people who knew it, and for the people who don't know it, I hope that you kind of get it on a feeling level, and that this is kind of, beyond a physical reality in a way, that because it's going back in the generations, that this voice and this prayer is coming from kind of a different plane.
Yeah, and I mean, luckily, fortunately, a lot of particularly traditional Jewish melodies that go along with prayers do, I think, convey emotionally what's going on in the prayer very well. They're very well matched. So I agree that it can have resonance for people who wouldn't know precisely what it's about.
Yeah, and that's
Go ahead.
it's actually Rabbi Lori's voice that is the woman singing, because she recorded it just as a reference for us to learn. And I was originally going to have an actor learn it, and obviously our main character had to learn it. So she was using it to learn the prayer, but then, we started using it as we were editing the film, and it was just so beautiful. Lori has just such a beautiful voice, and we just kind of asked her if it would be all right if she was just in the movie.
Yeah.
And she was excited about it. So
That's great.
yeah, that's actually her voice.
So I'm curious what motivated you to change the identity of the protagonist, knowing also that you still keep a prominent, not the main character, but a prominent character who is a young Native American woman who does talk about the importance of her identity.
Yeah, I had this story in my head that was about a Native American young woman who was feeling lost and disconnected from her culture and searching for a sense of self and a sense of belonging. And I started writing that film and moved to Montana to better understand what I was trying to write about, because I kind of just honestly kind of shot from the hip in terms of what the story was going to be about, and just had my own idea of what Montana is and the people who live there. And so I moved there to actually deepen my understanding of what's actually going on there. And along the way, started spending a lot of time and became friends with people, especially in the Northern Cheyenne, on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, and had a particular friend who I became close with, and she was inviting me to spend time with her family regularly over there. And as time went on, I started just kind of reflecting on my own background in a different way, and hearing the way that the people around me, the Indigenous people, were connected to their own trauma and their own history, was making me reflect on my own history in a different way, in a way that I had never thought about really and never considered deeply. And that, combined with becoming more and more self-conscious about being a non-Native person telling a Native story, combined with, it was 2016 and there was suddenly this uptick of anti-Semitism that was very obvious and very present. Yeah. All those things are what made me change it to be much more obviously personal. And it's actually the same story. It's just about Jewish historical trauma instead of Native American historical trauma.
I see. Well, thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
So this seems like a pretty typical Q&A question, but I am interested in the casting process, but particularly the thinking that went into casting Ray, since I feel like, I mean, of course, there are a number of other characters, but she really carries a lot of the film, right?
Yeah.
The actress you chose for Ray. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, of course, the most important character was the last person we ended up casting.
Uh-huh.
And it kind of came down to the wire because you're right that, the film was in a way only ever going to be as good as our lead character because so much of it is on her shoulders. And so in the end, honestly, we just got really lucky with finding Madeline. And Madeline is from Los Angeles, actually, and she got connected to us through a friend of a friend and sent in her tape. And she too is Jewish, actually, and she too is descendant of Eastern European Jews who fled. And so combined with her just having a really great audition tape and seeming to really understand the character and be really vulnerable, that we had that shared history made me feel confident that she would be able to do it and understand it. And I think, yeah, I almost feel like at a certain point she understood the character better than me, as she was taking on the role, and we were working together and I would ask her questions. And yeah, she really kind of dug into it and connected to it on a really deep level. And yeah, I think you see that on the screen.
I think so. I do think that shows. Yeah. Okay, so here's a big Jewish question.
Okay.
How did your own Jewish identity and your relationship to Jewishness influence the film? I feel like you've talked a little about this already because of just, you described how it shifted from being focused on Native American experience to Jewish experience. But another kind of maybe the fresher question now is, how did making the film affect your Jewish identity, your relationship to Jewishness? I would have to imagine it did, but if so, how would you say?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two main ways perhaps that my Jewish identity is reflected in this film. And one is the one I already talked about, just kind of the history of Holocaust survivor, like descendant of Holocaust survivors, that's coming from my own background. And two, I think what I was really excited about when the character became Jewish and the story was set in Montana, that I grew up in a small town in Iowa. And so like Ray, I grew up in a community, there were some Jewish people, and like Billings, there is a Jewish community. You see that Jewish community at the end of the movie, but it's small and it's the minority. And I think you don't always get to see Jewish people portrayed in film when it's not set in a place like New York City, or a place where it's kind of about being in a cultural hub of Jewishness. And people don't, I think, always realize that there's Jewish people that are living everywhere. You just might not know about it, or there's not very many people. And it's perhaps kind of unusual, but it's my personal experience, and it's many people's personal experiences. So I was excited to kind of reflect that in the film, and yeah, and just make it more visible. And I think that that's kind of the way perhaps that creating this film has affected me personally, is just that, I've been talking about Jewish identity a lot more than I ever have in my whole life. And I think since 2016 forward, I've felt just more passionate and more invested in being more visible as a Jewish person, and kind of claiming that identity and wanting to talk to people about it. Because I think that that's I mean, who knows what to do about anti-Semitism in general, but I think one thing we can do is just be visible and be vocal and not be an abstract idea for people who aren't Jewish, you know, that they don't have an idea of what a Jewish person is, that it's harder to feel hateful or have judgment towards a person if you just know them as an individual person and get to connect to them and understand them. So I think that's what I am excited about in terms of kind of touring around with this film and getting the opportunity to talk to people and kind of tell them a story that, you know, is fictionalized, but it's inspired by real things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, the kind of journey that you describe in your own experience, and that I think we also see with Ray in the film, of kind of being more at home in, or claiming more, or finding a way to live in the Jewish identity that maybe didn't have as much meaning or resonance in the past. I think that's a journey that's very much of Ray's generation. She, you know, I'm about twice her age, of my generation. So this whole block of Jewish Americans, you know, not certainly not the entire, you know, young adult Jewish American population, but there's less of a sense of obligation. Like there's more of a sense of, we have to figure out how this can be meaningful for us. We're not just going to do it because our parents are Jewish and we have to do these things. We have to find meaning in it. And I feel like that's part of what we do see in the film, is not always in ways that, I'm sure, you know, not always in ways that any of us would choose, but there are things that happen that that bring that identity more to the surface, I feel like, for her. And that for a lot of us, I think that's the case. We do have a question from an audience member, so I want to bring that in. Okay. So Judy says, many Holocaust survivors don't talk about their experiences, as many trauma victims in general don't either. In real life, how did you start broaching the topic of your parents' trauma, the question is, to learn about how their trauma affected them, and how did they start talking about their experiences and feelings to you? So there's a lot in that question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's very true and relatable, that often, and it makes sense, you know, if you've been through a traumatic thing, then why would you want to talk about that thing?
Right.
And you just want to move on and not have to relive any of that. But I think I personally feel that there's great healing to be had by talking about the things that are hardest and looking at it instead of running away from it, which you literally see Ray running a lot in the film, right? And that's kind of a part of that. And yeah, I guess in terms of talking to my own family, I mean, my part of why I'm even making this film is, and you see the dedication at the end, you know, my grandparents passed away before I was born, and they were Holocaust survivors. And so my dad, it's my dad's parents, and my dad obviously grew up with them and knows what that was like and had a specific experience. And I've grown up with my dad, and I know that experience, but I think that's a large piece about why I've always known, obviously, or, you know, most of my life have known that the fact that my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, but only since I started making this film and writing this story did I start actually feeling what that means in a deeper way. And I guess that's me. This film is me kind of trying to work out some of those things. So in a way, you know, I have talked to my dad a bit, and my dad also has had the experience of his parents not really talking to him about what they went through, but definitely gaining bits and pieces of stories throughout his life. So I'd say that this film is actually less of a reflection of talking to my family members about it, and more of my own kind of personal journey with it, and talking to other people in the Jewish community and in the Native American community as well. I think that honestly, that view of how Native American people relate to their own historical trauma, because they kind of have to in a different way, because they are physically, the main difference I see is, or one of the main differences is that they are on the land where these traumatic things happened. You know, they are very close to where these things happened. For Jewish people, we are not on that land, you know, it was in this other country. And we, you know, I personally have not had a traumatic life, but, you know, I think I've been starting to read more and more, and people have come up to me since, you know, through sharing this story, you know, the study of epigenetics even, and how trauma, studying historical trauma in Jewish communities, but also in all communities, you know, how trauma gets handed down on a DNA level even. So anyway, I guess I have found different people who have talked to me about historical trauma, but yeah, it's been kind of just my own personal journey of kind of reading a lot. I've been reading a lot of different books in this time, both about Jewish history and about Native American history, and just kind of pulling all of these thoughts and my personal experience together from there.
Well, thank you. And thanks to Judy for the question. I wanted to kind of highlight something you said a little bit ago, which is the significance of a film that looks at Jewishness, Jewish identity, being Jewish in the world, in a setting that is not very Jewish, or where there's not a large Jewish population. That's, I mean, it resonates tremendously in Spokane as well. And for me personally, and to look also, as you have in the film, at the phenomenon of anti-Semitism in that sort of setting, where there isn't strength in numbers, right?
Right.
It was, I mean, the flyers, the anti-Semitic flyers that show up repeatedly, right, on her door, and it's not clear, as Chrissy B says, it's not clear whether it's targeted or random, but it may be targeted. Like, don't discount the possibility that it's targeted. That is very familiar here in Spokane as well, unfortunately. And I was really struck by, I mean, there's two things. I was struck by the exchange that they have when they're up, I think they're kind of up on a bluff where there's an overlook. And it's clear that at that point, Ray wouldn't think much of leaving. It would be all right with her to leave. But Chrissy says that it is important to her to stay because this is where her ancestors were, you know, their presence is still felt, and that it took a lot to come back to this land and kind of reclaim at least some of it. That's very striking. Yeah. And it goes to what you're talking about, being on the land where it happened versus not. But I was also struck by the conversation, the exchange where Ray says, I thought this kind of thing didn't happen anymore. And I think she might be referring to the flyers. At one point, she's also painting over a swastika. So that general sort of thing. Yeah. And Chrissy says, none of this has ever gone away. And that really struck me because it's such a succinct illustration of how some historically persecuted populations have had some degree of privilege in not confronting hate throughout their lives, and some haven't had that privilege. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts about that theme in the film, particularly because so much of Ray's journey involves her ancestors' trauma becoming real for her.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that line specifically is something, comes from actually a story my dad told me once about when he grew up in Brooklyn after his family immigrated, and that he was experiencing anti-Semitism in various ways throughout his time growing up there. And I can't remember the exact incident that he was sharing with me, but he was telling me how he said that to his father, and, you know, said, back then, I thought this kind of thing didn't happen anymore. And his father had said, you know, it hasn't gone away, or something to that effect. And I resonated with that personally, because when those flyers that you mentioned, you know, are actually the exact flyers that showed up in Missoula the morning after the 2016 presidential election.
Oh my gosh.
And
Wow.
they were on the doorstep of the synagogue in Missoula. And then I got, that piece about targeting homes is what happened also in Missoula. And so that all that is taking, it's from what really happened. And that's how I felt, in that moment too. I thought this kind of thing didn't happen anymore, and I think you're super accurate in saying, the Jewish identity is really interesting in that way, because on one hand, we have a lot of privilege, and we benefit from a lot of white privilege. And then on the other hand, something can just switch all of a sudden, and we're actually in this other category in which all this hate is being directed towards us. So it's this kind of funny thing of how to, and also, is it a cultural identity? Is it ethnicity? Is it a religion? All these, it's not as clear cut, I think, as other identities maybe. And that makes it kind of hard to look at in some ways. And and I think you're right in that Jewish people and people who are around my age or so, have had the privilege to not have to grow up with a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism and to feel like it has gone away. And most people think that it has gone away until more recently, where it's just more blatant, and it's just has been actually, it never went away. It just hasn't been expressed lately and hasn't been supported and validated by our general culture that you can say this, because there's plenty of people who feel this way too. So it's really, it's just something that I continue to think about all the time. And I'm glad that section was effective. Just trying to kind of show the similarities and differences between Ray's identity and Chrissy B's identity.
Right. So I have a question now that's not so much a Jewish question and more of a filmmaking question. Towards the beginning of the film, there's a shot of, and I am sorry to describe them this way because I'm sure it's not right. They look like big agricultural cylinders. They're enormous, right? They're really big, and Ray is walking by them.
Oh yeah.
And she seems tiny.
Yeah.
And then toward the end, there's a shot of Ray and Our Lady of the Rockies, which PS, fascinating, kind of fun facts in there about Our Lady of the Rockies.
Yeah.
So there's a shot of her with Our Lady of the Rockies. Again, she's tiny. And there's this, Our Lady of the Rockies is this colossus. And so to me, it felt like sort of visual bookends. And I wondered if that was kind of an intentional thing you were doing. And if so, what were you trying to convey?
Yeah, thank you for that very precise observation of the film. I think those are, I believe, those big cylinders that she's walking by in the beginning are part of a sugar beet factory in Billings. And she doesn't really walk by it, but the presence of the Exxon refinery is very much in there too. And and I hadn't actually thought about tying together those moments of her being very small in the frame in the beginning and small in the frame in the end. But I really enjoy, I guess I just tend to do that maybe as a filmmaker. It's a way of showing, I guess, that how small she is, literally, and more emotionally as well, that she's kind of dwarfed. I think the difference perhaps to me in the beginning shot with the sugar beet factory and the end, close to the end shot with the Our Lady of the Rockies, is that she's dwarfed in a way. She's kind of being crushed at the beginning, like by all these big, large imposing forces around her. And at the end, she's on this more of a vista, right? And she's kind of overlooking all of Butte, and because by that time we've moved on to Butte, Montana. And
Right.
yeah, I think it's more just showing her being a part of a greater whole in a way, and that she's feeling at that moment more connected and more a feeling of peace or acceptance of the way things are at that moment.
Yeah, with the first of the two shots, I literally stopped, and I stopped the film and I was like, wow, that is a fantastic shot. Like, what a great location. Cool. Yeah, no, it's striking. And I feel like the things you were talking about thematically did kind of come across, but it's nice to hear you kind of more explicitly discuss them. We have an audience question. Was there a meaning or multiple meanings about that fire motif throughout? Obviously, fire had a big impact on Ray's life, and it's even, the title is We Burn Like This, but you focus on disabled smoke alarms, candles in a room, her mom lighting a cigarette in the darkness, etc. So was there a meaning or multiple meanings about the motif that you were going for?
Yeah. Wow. I just love, it's so nice when audience members are paying attention, obviously, and are having, putting things together. So thank you for your question. Yeah, fire is kind of always been a part of this story in both versions of the story, actually. And I think I'm curious to hear what other people's interpretations are, because I think it's a lot, like many things, this film, like many moments, this film asks the audience to kind of bring your own interpretation to certain things, that it doesn't spell everything out for you and leaves room for you to interpret it and bring meaning to it. But I think, yeah, the fire accident is literally a trauma, right, for her. And it has a physical scar to it that's a representation of it. And to me, that's also a larger representation, a visual in a way for the historical trauma that she's inherited, that in a way it's been kind of like dominoes, that here's the domino of her relative who, went through this horrific event with the Holocaust. And then here's the domino of her mother's, experience of that. And then how her decisions and shortcomings that resulted in, the trauma of the accident. And now Ray carries that. And it's up for her to heal it or not. But it's affecting her. So I think the burning is, destructive and trauma, but it's also a kind of, there's a lot of passion there too, that we play a lot with light and colors of light, of scenes feeling very warm or feeling very cool, depending on how Ray is feeling in that moment. And in a way, there's the fire is also kind of this longing for connection and a sort of larger than lifeness. And so the burn to me is, like many things in this film, it's both, there's a kind of duality of burning being negative and burning being positive, as a yearning and a kind of urgency to go for, or her need, I guess, to what she needs is healing, but she doesn't know that in the beginning.
Right. Well, I think I have a couple more questions, but I also welcome any others that come from folks in the audience here. So it's just so that I'm clear, is it Ray's grandmother or her great grandmother who's the Holocaust survivor?
Yes, it is. It's been both, actually, to be honest. Okay. I think it makes more sense timeline wise for her to be her great grandmother, even though, Ray is about 10 years younger than me, and it was my grandparents that were in the Holocaust. So it was written as her grandparents or her grandmother, but perhaps it makes more sense that it's a great grandmother. So
Oh, either way, I asked because it's relevant to my question, which is at the end, Ray is painting her grandmother, right? And there's imagery linking her and her mother to her grandmother, particularly the running, kind of cutting between the three of them running.
Yeah.
And then the final image of the film, to me, felt almost like a sainthood image with kind of a halo, right?
Yeah.
And that made me think of Our Lady of the Rockies. And that sequence itself has an interesting interfaith component in that you have this massive Catholic/Christian image that is juxtaposed with a Jewish prayer. And so I'm interested in hearing sort of your thinking behind this layering and juxtaposing of the faith imagery, right?
Yeah, thank you. You know, there were versions of this story when I first started rewriting the story to be about a Jewish young woman. I wrote it as that in the end, she visits actually a Holocaust museum, and that same kind of scene happens in that environment. Because I was kind of pulling from my own experience in that, because the first time I visited a Holocaust museum, it was a very profound and powerful experience. And so that's what I originally imagined, but there is no Holocaust museum in Montana. And I was researching it, and I saw that there's plans to build one in Bozeman, but it doesn't actually exist yet. And so then I started thinking about, okay, where could this take place? And the Our Lady of the Rockies statue is just one of the most bizarre things that I've ever come across.
Yeah.
It's this 90-foot statue on top of the Continental Divide in Butte, Montana, and it, you know, glows at night. And as you see in the movie, you can go inside, and it's this beautiful memorial. And it's also specifically a memorial for women. And I don't think we don't get that specific in the film, but that's what it is. And you know, there are plaques in there that are men and women, but it's specifically honoring women. And so that's why I guess that I felt this kind of female line connection, you know, of the females in her history, that's what she's processing and honoring. So in that moment when she actually says the prayer aloud that we've been hearing, that's her ancestors singing, that she kind of owns that in a different way, owns that identity in a different way. And it's a prayer, because it's a healing prayer, it's a prayer for both herself and for her ancestors and for her mother, for everyone. But I was excited about the idea of it being that memorial happens to be focused on women and for women. And when I visited there for the first time, there was a lot of language about, you know, this being a memorial for anyone. And we went through kind of a long process with the board of directors of that memorial, you know, because it's a very special place and very spiritual place for people. And you know, we just met with them and talked with them about the kind of scene we wanted to film there and what the significance was. And you know, they wanted a translation of the prayer. They wanted to know what we were doing, because it's meaningful to them. And I kept assuring them that the scene is in line with this kind of place. It is honoring the kind of spiritual nature of this place, and that's why we want to be here. So I think, I think that it's surprising to see, you know, that she would be kind of there and kind of mirroring the Mother Mary in that moment. But I think I don't know. I guess I'm trying to point to the similarities in a way between religions, and that it's bigger than just a specific religious identity. In that moment, it's more about healing and connection.
Well, in some places and images have spiritual power or energy that can be felt whether or not you are, a member of that faith. Right?
Mhm.
Is something else I kind of picked up from that. So there's another audience question, and then I think after that I only have one more question for you myself. So the question from the audience: did you shoot more footage of the trauma to raise Mother, and if so, why did you choose to depict it as you did?
Mm. Did we shoot more of the? Oh, I see. We didn't shoot more of the trauma to what happened to Ray's mother. I think we definitely could have in hindsight, but I think, we wanted to keep the focus on Ray, and that it's more left to your imagination of what happened to the mother, since, Ray, we're so in Ray's perspective throughout the movie. I'd say the only time we leave Ray's perspective is when we cut to the past, right, of the little flashes of the Holocaust. But even that, I see those moments as, her imagination of those moments, and because they are so fast. And it was a pretty strict rule, I guess, to stay within Ray's perspective. And so that would be, if we were to fully go into a memory and fully see her mother's experience, her mother would become the protagonist in that moment, and we would leave behind things that Ray could have actually seen, which happens all the time in movies. But it's just not the kind of movie that we were making, which was kind of very kind of stuck. You're just with Ray and that's it.
Right. The crude and maybe old-fashioned term, it would be a character study. I think it's more than that. That is a piece of what maybe is going on. Okay, so I the last question I have really for you is an old chestnut. It's a commonplace question, which is, I would love to hear, if you are willing to tell, how things are going with the next two films that you're working on, the narrative documentary, to the extent that you have something to tell. I would be interested to hear it.
Yeah. Well, I can also say, in terms of We Burn Like This, I can't announce anything quite yet, but it will be available to the wider world later this year at some point. So I encourage people to kind of find us on our social media platforms on Instagram and Facebook, or join our mailing list, which is all can be found at weburnlikethis.com. And you can stay in the loop of when we get to announce the film coming out to the wider world beyond the festival world. And so that's exciting for We Burn Like This. And then for my next projects, they're both in development right now. The script is, we're in the midst of kind of putting things together for it. And for the documentary, I actually want to, the documentary project is almost a documentary version of We Burn Like This in some ways, in that it's just kind of continuing the conversation of Jewish identity and sense of place. And for years, I've been really curious about going to Poland, which is where our family is from. And I've never been, and my dad has never been. And so one of the main parts of the film, the documentary, will be my dad and I going to Poland and seeing what happens. And so that I've never made a documentary before.
Wow.
That I've always made narrative films so far, but I've been working for Big Sky Documentary Film Festival in Missoula for the last number of years, and been really inspired by a lot of documentaries I've been seeing over these years. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure it'll be kind of a lifelong exploration of Jewish identity for me personally. So I'm kind of just continuing that as a documentary. And yeah, it's kind of picking up in a way where We Burn Like This is leaving off.
Well, I will say, completely unbiased, that if you are interested in the future with that film or other films that you may make in regional Jewish film festivals, I happen to know one that might appreciate
Sure, yeah.
what you have made. So yeah, thank you so much for your time and for talking about your film. There's so much more we could talk about, but I feel like I asked the main things I wanted to, and I'm so glad that that the film is getting an audience here in Spokane. I think it's a very meaningful place for it to be seen.
Totally. Yeah, I was really excited about it because Spokane is only about 3.5 hours from Missoula, I believe. And yeah, it's Missoula or Montana's neighbor. So a lot of the
Jewish
things,
communities in Washington have relationships with the ones in Montana. So it really is a connection.
Yeah. So yeah, it's great. We've played in Montana, but we haven't played in Idaho or Oregon or Washington yet. So it's great to bring it to the Pacific Northwest.
Indeed.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again. And, also to SpIFF for having me. And yeah, I wish you all the best in your future work.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the conversation. And,
Absolutely. Glad to
the
have it.
opportunity.
Of course. All right. Take care.
You too.